Welcome to the debate. So, the material before us today lays out this truly comprehensive, unified, African centered framework. It asserts that the path toward liberation and achievement isn't just about superficial school reform, it's much deeper. It demands intentional control of socialization, and it's all grounded in African moral philosophy.
It really is a remarkable framework because it refuses to compartmentalize anything. You see, it's a continuous system tying together everything from, foundational moral texts to identity, discipline, all the way to systemic control and measurable outcomes. The challenge isn't the completeness of the vision, that's crystal clear. It's about the strategic implementation.
And that really is the heart of our discussion today. If we accept the integrated nature of this monumental vision, where does the foundational priority have to lie? Where is the first point of strategic leverage? Do we prioritize securing the internal moral operating system, the ethics of Mott, and the daily practice of Ptahhotep? Or do we focus first on reclaiming external control of the socializing institutions, the core principle of African power? I'm going to argue that the internal foundation, character formation, it has to precede everything else.
And I'll be maintaining the opposing strategic priority. While that moral and ethical foundation is, absolutely vital, the material shows us the sheer degree of damage that's been inflicted by historical disruption and cultural warfare. The mind has to be decolonized first, secured through reclaiming external control over the very systems that inflict all that psychological damage. Only then can Ma'at reliably, truly take root.
Okay, so my core thesis is really based on the material's primary diagnosis here, which is that the foundational threat is psychological slavery, menticide. And this damage, critically, it occurs before formal schooling even begins. The paper states it explicitly: schools inherit the mind they are given. So therefore, the immediate, the most critical intervention has to be establishing moral order at the earliest point of influence, the family, the individual. We have to fix that internal operating system first. Otherwise, everything we build on top of it is just going to be structurally unsound. The material makes Ma'at a non-negotiable moral operating system. For anyone who isn't familiar, Ma'at is the civilizational law of ancient Kemet. It establishes truth, justice, balance, order. It's the abstract moral ideal. But the actionable part comes from Ptahhotep's teachings, which they serve as the practical, daily ethical manual.
The implementation plan for Ma'at, if you will. The warning in the text is it's profound. Without this moral foundation, intelligence can serve exploitation, and leadership becomes ego-driven. Just think about the implications of that. Your genius gets weaponized against your own community because it has no ethical grounding. Our primary defense against internalized inferiority, the very definition of psychological slavery, has to be this internal standard of behavior. It has to ensure that character formation precedes credential acquisition.
I fully accept the severity of menticide, but I have to return to the structural causes of that condition. While Ma'at is the necessary ethical compass, the historical evidence presented in the material suggests it is difficult, if not, impossible, to cultivate it consistently when the systems that inflict psychological warfare are fully operational and externally controlled. We can't just treat the individual symptoms of a socialization failure, we have to control the means of socialization itself. The material is clear. Educational failure is fundamentally a socialization failure. That directly implies that the external environment is the primary vector of the damage. The text meticulously details the historical mechanisms of menticide, the systematic rape of the mind through banning languages, rewriting history, cultural erasure, all of it perpetrated by external, hostile systems designed to define African identity as a problem.
This is a perpetual war, and it's being fought in the cultural sphere. The text meticulously details the historical mechanisms of menticide, so the first actionable step has to be reclaiming control of what the material calls the first socializing institutions. And yes, we're talking about the home, but also peer groups, community institutions, and especially media exposure. Education isn't neutral terrain. The material says it's contested terrain, and the external environment dictates the internal possibility for moral excellence and discipline. We have to stop the barrage of anti-African messaging before we can expect Mott to flourish.
Okay. That's a powerful articulation of the historical context. I mean, emphasizing external systems of control as the point of initial attack. I really do see why you prioritize that systemic defense. But let me offer a different perspective, one that's rooted in the source material's emphasis on psychological liberation. If psychological slavery is, as the text states, the most enduring form of domination, then the solution has to be immediate moral and ethical inoculation at the personal and familial level. And that's regardless of the hostile external environment. Tahotep doesn't wait for systemic control, it gives us the daily practice of Ma'at right now. These principles, correcting without humility, exercising humility in leadership, ensuring disciplined thought, these are the immediate remedies for internal trauma and the breakdown of discipline. You're rightly concerned with the structural integrity of the house, but I'm arguing we have to first ensure the architect is morally sound. We have to forge that moral conscience internally so that when we do reclaim external control, that power is exercised justly and collectively, and it's not corrupted by individual ego.
I appreciate that focus on moral integrity. I do. However, I would frame the strategic priority differently. The historical analysis in the material clearly identifies who inflicted the initial damage and who maintains it. It's external systems, colonial powers, institutional education, mass media. They are what impose the enslaver's mindset. So how can we expect parents or community leaders who themselves have been subject to decades of this menticide, this psychological warfare, to consistently model the rigorous high-level ethics of Ma'at Imhotep? Especially when the external narratives controlling their children's peer groups, their media exposure, their economic opportunities, all of it is constantly undermining African identity and defining success by European standards. I mean, the structural influence is overwhelming. The battle must be fought by controlling the narrative and the cultural institutions first. The material on SBA.
The reawakening of the African mind confirms that identity restoration, a clear, positive definition of self secured by controlled cultural input, is structurally necessary. If children are taught through frameworks that deny or distort their reality, their potential is capped. The moral lessons become fragile. Morality can only be genuinely internalized once the structural foundation of self-worth is restored through external control. Otherwise, Ma'at becomes an aspiration, not an operating system.
But let me press on that point. If we wait for full external control, which is a massive, long-term project, what stops the leadership we put in place, the very people raised in this externally dependent system, from succumbing to the exact ego-driven behaviors the material warns us against? You've identified the system as the problem, but we have to use people to change that system. And without that deep internal commitment to Ma'at, our leaders might just replicate the old patterns of exploitation, just with different faces.
That's a very strong point about Ma'at being the ultimate defense against corruption. We both agree that if the system is seized by ego, the whole effort fails. But where does the material suggest we find the stability to forge that moral conscience when the external environment is just fundamentally hostile? We're talking about a daily attrition here. Think about peer groups, which the material lists as a primary socializing institution. So parents teach Ma'at at home, but the social, economic, and cultural pressure from externally controlled media and peer influences can totally defeat that familial moral instruction by the time a child reaches adolescence. To allow Ma'at to flourish, we must secure the environment. We have to stop the external system from actively eroding the moral infrastructure we're trying to build day by day. This means controlling the local systems, community spaces, youth programs, media exposure that shape identity.
This isn't waiting for global control, it's demanding local African power over the immediate cultural environment.
Let's shift then to the operational side of it. Let's consider disciplined leadership. The material is brutally honest about the failures of past movements, often attributing them to inconsistency, ego over mission, and a lack of accountability. Now, I come at this from the perspective that leadership requires a secure operational base. I mean, how can leaders enforce standards and correct immediately as Section 7 demands if those very leaders and the communities they serve are operating from a place of deep-seated dependency on external validation, or worse, a fear of accountability that was systematically instilled by enslaving systems? The history shows that economic orientation and political positioning were weaponized to destroy African community structures.
So we have to implement African power control, our economic institutions, secure our political positioning before we can build a secure, self-sustaining, mission-driven leadership structure that's capable of maintaining true disciplinary standards. The internal moral code requires a secure, autonomous external base to operate from. Otherwise, any attempt at rigorous self-discipline is always susceptible to external economic manipulation.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning because disciplined leadership, which is defined by adherence to high standards and immediate accountability, is precisely what is required to execute the reclamation of those external institutions in the first place. You can't delegate the moral decision-making. The material emphasizes a crucial fundamental point. Ideas without discipline do not liberate.
The core leadership failures it lists, inconsistency, ego over mission, the lack of measurable goals, these are fundamentally internal, ethical deficiencies. They aren't just resource constraints, they are moral failures that are addressed directly by Ma'at and Ptahhotep. The material emphasizes a crucial fundamental point. Let's be concrete. Imagine a community successfully reclaims control of a local development budget or a key social service institution, an act of African power. Without the moral constraints of Ptahhotep guiding the leadership, principles like impartiality, humility, prioritizing the collective mission over personal gain, that leader, who was raised in the system of dependency, might divert funds, play favorites, or hide failures. This is the very definition of power becoming ego-driven. Ma'at is the quality control for that power. We have to build that internal integrity first, or the systems we fight to control will simply become mirrors of the corruption we are trying to flee.
I understand the fear of internal corruption, I do. But the material also makes it clear that systemic trauma hinders our capacity for internal discipline. So I would argue that the primary failure isn't a lack of ethics, it's the structural inability to enforce those ethics autonomously. We see community leaders consistently undermine each other not because they fundamentally lack Ma'at, but because the external systems, economic gatekeepers, hostile media, political opponents, provide massive incentives for deviation and dependency. If we secure the external base first, economic self-reliance, community political unity, we reduce the leverage that external forces have over our internal moral decisions. Once a leader knows they are accountable only to a secure, unified, self-determining community, which is African power, the ability to enforce Ptahhotep's standards dramatically increases. The fight for control provides the environment necessary to practice high moral discipline without immediate catastrophic consequences.
Okay, let's shift our focus to the ultimate goal defined in the material, which is achievement matters, building a producer culture. This goal, it requires pairing consciousness with tangible, measurable outcomes, daily academic routines, clear performance targets, reading benchmarks. This system requires an incredible internal discipline and adherence to the high expectations driven by the Mott Foundation. Liberation without this tangible, measured achievement leaves communities vulnerable, both economically and intellectually. We have to secure the moral foundation to sustain the rigor that's required for a true producer culture. This system of achievement, as it's presented, demands that children are taught the value of sustained effort, accountability, and the rejection of intellectual complacency. That commitment to rigor is a direct application of Mott truth and order applied to cognitive development.
If we focus too heavily on external control without establishing that internal ethical rigor, we might end up with locally controlled institutions that still fail to produce competitive outcomes because of a lack of disciplined application.
That is a compelling argument, the necessity of measurable outcomes. But the question remains, measured outcomes for what purpose? And how are they measured? I mean, have you considered the findings of Unbank the Fire? That research is absolutely clear on this. African learners thrive when instruction is culturally congruent and identity-affirming. If we prioritize external control, and by that I mean community-controlled learning spaces, culturally grounded curriculum advocacy, control over local media input, we guarantee that the mastery-based progression and high expectation systems align with the African reality, that they serve the purpose of liberation, not assimilation. If we don't control the system design first, which requires African
African power, those high-performance targets and measurable outcomes risk becoming just a new mechanism for assimilation. They become compliance metrics demanding conformity to a Eurocentric standard disguised as achievement. When instruction denies a child's identity, you are asking them to perform cognitive gymnastics just to meet the standard, regardless of their internal ethics. The external system design determines the quality and, crucially, the liberating nature of that achievement. Achievement flows from affirmed identity, and identity is determined by the systems of socialization we must reclaim.
To summarize my position then, the integrated framework, while it is comprehensive, mandates grounding in Ma'at and Patahtep first. This internal moral operating system dictates how identity is affirmed, how leadership is exercised, and how achievement systems are applied. The internal moral foundation is the gyroscope that secures the value and direction of all subsequent external effort. It ensures the power we seek will be used for collective justice, not ego-driven exploitation.
And I'll summarize by stressing the complexity of historical disruptions and ongoing psychological warfare. These forces require the immediate, active defense and reclamation of the first socializing institutions, which is the core directive of African power. This external control is the necessary prerequisite to fully reawaken the African mind and to establish a fertile, secure, and stable ground for the sophisticated ethics of Ma'at to truly flourish and to guide our leaders and communities successfully.
It is absolutely clear that both internal moral grounding and external systemic control are essential components of this comprehensive liberation framework. The material does not allow us to ignore either one.
No, it doesn't. But the key difference between us and the strategic question the material really forces us to ask, it lies in the sequencing. What constitutes the necessary, foundational first step on the path toward true African-centered liberation and achievement? The material provides an integrated map, but that path forward, it remains powerfully open to this vital strategic interpretation.